Get started again. According to the agenda, we're in part 3, but I'm going to finish up part 2 stuff, and then Eric will come on up and talk about whatever's in part 3. I don't remember. So I was talking about web parts, and there's some great questions that came up, so let's continue talking a little bit about web parts and cover all those. So, not PowerShell. I'm running, so let me stop this. So one question a gentleman asked about, in this particular scenario, he was experiencing error when he was consuming a list data. He wrote link to consume a list data, and if the list had 2,499 items, it worked, and if it had 2,500, it was giving him a dialog prompt. And that's got nothing to do with our scenario, but my first question was, why are you retrieving 2,500 items in a list, or in one request on a list, right? Humans don't process that much information, but that doesn't mean end users don't ask for it. So the Microsoft's big brother answer to that is the list threshold, or the throttling threshold. There's a setting that says, I'm only going to let you retrieve 2,000 items in a single request on a list. Unless you're an administrator, then you can get 5,000. And there's an API to override the throttle if you want, but then there's a central administration setting to override the override, and so on and so forth. My point is, we should be smart about retrieving this list data. And so in my example here, I have a grid, and my grid is I'm going to show list items. And as you can see, I'm just doing my filtering. And actually, I kind of pretended I didn't get any data because I didn't specify a filter. But if you look at my initial query, you can see I'm just saying approved. And in my little load data application, I put 148 articles out there, and they were all approved. So I would get 148 articles in my initial request, which doesn't sound like much. But how many people here look at 148 items all at once and understand it, right? You don't. You get 148 items, and you chart it or do something, right? Because humans can't process that much information. So in theory, what I want to do is show 10 or 20 at a time and do paging. So I ran out of time to code it. But in general, you should be doing paging. And if I would just tell the grid view, hey, I have a page size of 10 and enable paging true and have at it, the grid view is going to request every item so that it can come up with a count. 148, page size is 10, that's 15 pages. So it'll read 148 items and show you 10. And then when you click next page, it does a post back, and it reads 148 items, and it shows you 11 through 20. Really not optimal, right? So the official's the wrong term. The way I would fix that is I would code an object data source and bind my grid to the object data source, and the object data source will fire an event called selecting. And in the selecting event, I can then say, it tells me I want page 3 and the page size is 10. So then I know, I want 21 through 30, and I can write my query to give me rows 21 through 30. SQL Server, that's easy. We have the skip and the take, or the top and skip are the two clauses I would specify in SQL Server. And those are carried over into link, and you can see the IEnumerable class that my article is, or my iQueryable class, the collection I'm looking at here, does have take and skip. So the way I've coded this query is, if my page size is 10, and my page is 0, first page, I'm going to skip 0 and take 10. So I've specified my link query to do server-side paging. Under the covers, Camel doesn't do server-side paging in this manner. And I did see in the SDK an example on how to do server-side paging in a console application, and I just didn't have time to investigate that. But if you think about it, if I do an out-of-the-box list view and I set my page size to be 30, I can go, or I think the default is 30, right? I get paging. So there's some paging going on somewhere in SharePoint, right? So my message to you is, you shouldn't just say, give me every item all the time. And in fact, what I've arbitrarily done here is I'm only retrieving 10 items at a time. So the first time I show the grid, I'm getting the first 10. And if you do a filter, I'm giving you the 10 most recent. I'm doing I have order by descending on created date. So that's just something that I threw in there because I made a decision on that. And then when the rest of them found out, they said, well, that's kind of stupid. I said, yeah, I know, but how do you fix the problem? And we never came to a resolution on fixing it, right? So that's an exercise for the audience in how to fix that. You're welcome. All right, so covers everything here, I believe. Yes. All right, so the next thing I want to show you, I talked about that log, the log parameter on the data context, and it's not in this code. Before I go further, though, I'm going to change. I think we can all agree that I don't need to have tab sizes that big, yes? So we'll shrink that down a little bit. So I'm going to just modify it on the fly, right? Breaking rule number 1 of demos, but it's not a real demo unless you break the rules. I'm going to define a string writer. I'm typing on a Swedish keyboard. That's my story.
Is that why it says English up there?
I didn't say it was a true story. I just said it was my story. Right? So I'm defining, again, I have some, I keep saying module level because of my old VB days, but I have a page level variable at the top, and I'm going to, on page load, I'm going to define these items, and so SW equals new string writer, and then dc.log equals SW. So what I've done here now, let me move that up a little bit for you. The data context is the thing that SP Metal generated. The SharePoint product team implemented this property called log, in which if you pass it a string writer of some sort, it will then write to that writer the camel that is generated. I don't think the link to SQL does that, and I know that link to XML does not do that. So this is because the SharePoint team did that. So we can all thank them next time we see them. And then down here, the generation from this iQueryable QRY object, that conversion to camel, doesn't happen until the query is executed. That's a feature of LINQ, the language integrated query, is what they call defer execution. So all this time up above where I'm defining the where clauses, nothing really happens. And then at the very end, when I choose this option here to this line 67, at the very end it says toList. When I call that method, then it's executed. So after that's executed, I can then I can look at it. So it's sw.toString. And so I will set a breakpoint here. So I've just validated the compile time features of Visual Studio. I love the sandbox. Did I not?
Were you putting that screen?
I thought I hit the F5. I thought I set a breakpoint. I guess I didn't. There we go. And now if I look, so if I S, and I just hover over that, that's just a string. So what I did is I use the immediate window, and I'll put the value of S, and I pasted it into the slide deck for you, just as a convenience. So that is how I can get that log option, and again, double check it. And so, especially if you're new to LINQ, this is incredible. When I was first learning LINQ, it was all, this where things and the lambda expressions. Hey, I grew up on the IBM mid-range computer. Lambda expressions was totally rocket science to me. So I would never figure out why things didn't work, and this log was incredibly helpful because I could look at the camel, and if I did it wrong in the .where clause, I'd get the where element of this. See here, this XML, the where and begins with, that would be empty. So then I knew the problem was. I was convinced that LINQ didn't work, and Microsoft wrote it wrong. And then I learned later that I was writing it wrong. So that's how that works. So I'm going to stop this. And I'm going to go back and load more data. This was a lot easier on my dev box that had SP1 instead of all this other stuff. London.local. And okay, I think that works, so I don't need this now. So let me go on. Now, one other thing that I want to talk about, which When I created, remember I said before, half joking, that we had the discussion about naming conventions too late and the project structure too late? So in this structure that we have now, and this is not a criticism, I'm just pointing this out, I have folders here called SP web parts. And if I were to add a new web part to this, called web part 1, just for grins, look at my namespace of my web part. And we all love to see web part 3 times in our class names, right? So how often this is because the folder, Visual Studio is helping us out by replicating the folder structure in our namespace, which may or may not be right. And that's always fun to fix. And so what I did is after years and years of muscle memory on changing it, I put it in here. If you want to change the namespace of your web part, here's what you have to do, right? You need to go in and change it in the class. If you have the visual web part, you need to make sure you change it in the code behind. You need to make sure the safe control entry gets fixed, and you have to change the web part file. Those are the 4 areas. And again, this is just for a web part. Now, another trick that I thought everyone knew this, and maybe you do, but I have this web part, and let's say I want to change this to just say it's web part 1, just for grins here, okay, right? And Control Z, there we go. So I have this web part 1, and I said you need to change it in a couple places. And so what I can do in this class view, you'll see that it has the web part. Here's web parts. My namespace is web part 1. If I right-click on this in the class view window, I have an option to copy. So this will copy my class name to the clipboard. Because if you're like me, from looking at it in my brain, and then I have to think, how do I find the safe control entry in Visual Studio? By the time I find the safe control entry location, I've forgotten what I needed. Does that ever happen to you guys? The gray-haired guys are nodding yes, so I feel a little better. So in my Solution Explorer, in the properties, the safe control entry setting, by the way, is in here. If I click on the web part, if I click on the SPY, which is really a folder, I'm not clicking on the actual ASCX or the code file, but I click on the SPY, you'll see the safe control entries are here. And this is one place in which they don't use the tokens. The namespace for the safe control is not a token. The assembly is, but the namespace is not. And since it's in my clipboard, I can then paste it in here. So that's the little. So class view helps you find what those are. And then in the slide deck, you'll see that is there. So if you need to change your namespaces later, you can do so. And I'm going to remove it because it's not part of my solution. As much as we love web part 1. All right. I showed you my details web part. The summary, and now I have a details web part. So let me just close these all down. And we'll go into our details. Again, I use the visual web part. And you can see here, I'm not using the grid. Just a bunch of divs and labels to get through with the special class names to make it look the way we want. Nothing all too exciting. You'll see here, though, I just coded in here text equals article.title. That doesn't mean anything. I could do data binding if I could figure out how to bind a single object without doing the whole master grid thing, and I finally couldn't remember, so I punted. That's just a string that I threw in there because when I flipped over to design mode and I put my CSS in there, which doesn't work, this was just a convenience for Paul to get the styling right without having to worry about the code behind to retrieve the current item, right? Again, that's just something I did. If I go back to the code behind, now you can see in here, this is going to look familiar. I'm going to pull the queries. From the query string, I'm going to get the ID of the item they selected. And then I'm going to build my query. Notice the difference here is I have the where clause here isn't approved. It's just that particular item. So I will get the one item there, and then I just do your typical from the property to the control, and then done. On pre-render, I fix up my CSS link, and I'm done here. So nothing rocket science here. Again, I don't have to worry about postbacks. I don't have to worry about validations. I'm just doing a display, right? All that grunt work is done for me by the SharePoint framework out of the box. Of course, they don't do validation at all. They don't do any useful validation in the lab form. So if your business requirement says validate the data that they're entered, you may end up writing a custom form anyways, which is what I suspect Eric really wanted us to do. But it wasn't the requirement, so I didn't do it. I'm glad someone chuckled. I'm not the only one who doesn't do it. All right, so web parts. Okay, so I have web parts now. Next, I said before, a web part is a natural component for us to write because I can take this web part and put it anywhere. And you can see I went into the home page and I did my, on the home page, I dropped a web part on there. And now we don't see it because I've retracted the solution. So let me go into, oh, I have two of them. Isn't that lovely?
The second one's mine.
You don't need it. If he does, he can reopen it later. And I'm going to deploy. One of the other questions that during the break came up, right, about deleting data when you deactivate some features and so on. And I just want to point out here, remember my list goes away? My list went away because Visual Studio detected that I have a list instance feature in my project. So Visual Studio understands that deploying a list instance feature when the list already exists is usually a bad thing. So it's helping me out by deleting the list for me. And when I first did this, it gave me a dialog that says conflict resolution is what it's called. It said, do you want to delete these, yes or no? And at some point I hit the button and said, yes, do it all the time, don't ask me anymore. And so that's what it's done. So deactivating the list instance feature is not deleting the list. Visual Studio is deleting the list. So the moral of the story is don't run Visual Studio against the production site. As tempting as that is, it's a bad idea. I've just deployed. I expect my list is gone. I'm going to load my sample data again, and I'm going to go back to my home page, and I expect to see something that's not an error. Remember, I'm doing a sandbox solution, and when it's retracted, the assembly, or in any WSP, web part is a compiled code, DLL. It gets deployed to the server. When you retract, it gets removed from the server. So on my home page, I said put a web part, and in the web part file, the web part file points to the assembly that it needs to load. If I remove the assembly, that's that message I get. So because I removed the assembly, I didn't change the home page. I put the assembly back, it works. So I have this pretty looking grid with details in there. If I scroll down, you'll see I have 10 or 20, not as many as you would expect. So I can put the web part anywhere. And in fact, I can go in and modify this page, and I expect to see a details web part. Add a web part. And you can see here in my list of categories, if I choose ISCK base, this is defined in the web part file. I'm supposed to show you that. So this is one of Paul's tips. Did you know you can customize this icon? Nice little touch so you make your application look a little bit more professional, unless you're in a sandbox in which you can't deploy the icon file where it needs to be in order to include it. So in the advanced solution on Codeplex, you'll see the web part files have whatever the property is for the logo image, it's in there. And it also has a feature that deploys a bunch of files to the images mapped folder, which I can't do in the sandbox. So I can do this. If I put it in here, I'm just going to add this to the bottom. And I get an unexpected error. Wonderful. It wouldn't have worked anyways. If you remember the code in my details web part, I was asking for the ID that was in the query string. And in my grid, I had hard-coded a URL that I want to go to with my details. So I have this details web part, but it really isn't that portable, is it? The details web part needs to have a query string ID in order for it to render the knowledge base article. And end users aren't going to get, number one, if they knew how to do $ID equals in the query string, that'd be part of the victory, but they wouldn't know what ID number they want. So let me stop editing here. What I've done here is that we want to deploy this details web part on a page, and I want to know what that page is. So I'm going to just create a page and put it on there. So where do I put my page? I can't go to underscore layouts. That's an application page. I can't go there from the sandbox. So I need to deploy a page into the content database. If it was publishing, it would be in the pages library. If it was a wiki site, you'd have a site pages library. I don't have either one of those. I just have a team site, or a blank site actually here. So I need to provision a page and then put the web part on the page. So we'll cover that next. Another thing that I wanted to do is if I go back to my Visual Studio project in the Solution Explorer, if I were to go in and this .webpart file, if I delete this .webpart file and then redeploy, that details webpart would not show in the gallery. The .webpart file, the XML for this element file deploys a module into the webpart gallery that points to this file points to the assembly. If I remove this file, now I take the details out of the webpart gallery, which might be a better end user experience. Your mileage may vary, right? If you have a webpart that really has some requirements about how it needs to work and you don't want end users monkeying around with it, you can delete the .webpart from your Visual Studio Solution and it'll never go into the gallery. Or maybe better to edit the elements.xml and comment it out so they don't lose the webpart file. Well, something along those lines. That's something you can do. There's no requirement that says you have to have a .webpart for every piece of server code that you run. Does that make sense? All right, so I want to talk about pages. What do I got? Let me flip over and go through my 2 or 3 slides on that. Here are the types of pages. We talked about application pages. We can deploy a page as a module. There are some requirements around that. You cannot have inline server code, so you can't have OpenAlligator %sign and then some kind of code. Doesn't work. That's the page mode parser.
Alligator.
Yeah, alligator. We don't all talk like Texans. I'm sorry. It just doesn't work that way. How many people did not know what I meant by OpenAlligator? Oh, good Lord. So I can't have a... See, that's why I call it a name, because I can't have a less than sign followed by a %sign and then write some code. That's inline code. That doesn't work. And if you search on Bing, you can modify the page mode parser and make some of that kind of stuff work, which is all crazy, stupid ideas. So I can't do that. If I'm in a full trust solution, I can deploy a page as a module, and what ends up happening is it's stored in the SharePoint root in the file system, and you can do controls and web parts by specifying an @register directive and so on. That all works great in a full trust solution. If you're in a sandbox, it's actually pulling that page from the content database, and you have to load the web parts using this wonderful thing that I didn't discover until Victor told me, hey, there's this thing called the SP user code web part. And if you look here, this looks familiar. It's the same type of information I would put in a .webpart file. The difference here is that SharePoint knows that I need to get this code and run it in the SP user code process instead of my IIS process. And so get the slide deck after the conference and go to Victor's blog, and he's got a whole write-up about how this works. So that's what I'm going to use to provision a page, and on that page I want to show my details web part. So let's switch over and see where we're at. Close this. And so in my SP, oh, wait a minute, before I go too far. I deploy web parts using a feature. Web parts are useful functionality. In most cases, in my experience, it makes sense to put them in their own web part because if it has useful functionality, I want to be able to have people turn it on and off. So it's scoped to the site collection because that's where the web part gallery is scoped to the site collection. And you can see I simply have my 2 web parts put in there. Originally, I had my web parts and the web part pages that I'm about to show you in the same feature. And it worked for me. It didn't work for the rest of the group. So this is one of those trade-offs that come in that they decide I need to change the feature packaging decisions. Fortunately, you can use the little arrows to move them back and forth. So that's common to go and reorganize features. One of the features of CKS Dev that I learned yesterday, thanks Waldek, is if I have all these items in my project, let me go back here and close this down. And so I have a K-base article details. That's a bad example. That's next. If I look at my fields, I can right-click on this and choose, hey, where's the option to say locate it?
It's the view command. It's actually a bug.
OK, so if I click on view command, it will then tell me down here in the output that this SharePoint object field is in this feature.
And you go to the error list, and from here, if you click on it, double click, you'll automatically go to that feature. Whoa! You didn't know that.
So I've been doing SharePoint development a long time, and AC's been doing it a long time, and neither one of us knew this thing existed. So you know what that means? We need volunteers to join the CKS Dev project to help write documentation.
That'll be next door.
Next door. That's classic. That's classic. Okay. What was I talking about? Pages. I'm easily distracted. All right. So I have a pages. So remember in the slide deck I said how that pages need to deploy as a module. And module is the term that SharePoint uses whenever you want to put something into the content database. And I could use up all of Eric's time in part 3 by talking about what's the database, what's the file system, and so on. Long story short, we're going to deploy something into the content database, whatever that means, by using a module. And so I did add a new object, and I added a module. And in this particular case, I chose app pages. I created a folder called app pages, which I didn't really know what to call it. I mean, application pages mean something. But what kind of page is this? It's a page that's used by my application. But so I just chose app pages. You can choose whatever suits you. And if I look in this, you can see here I have my elements file. And I'm going to reformat that so you can see. I'm just deploying a file from a certain file path to a URL path. And my URL path just says app pages / article summary and app pages / article details. And if I go back to my site and I choose View All Site Content, I do not have a list nor a library named app pages. So there's no requirement that says you have to deploy these things into a library. And in my case, that's kind of good. I don't want anyone monkeying with these pages. I'm expecting these pages to do certain things, right? We had that talk already. I want them to do certain things. If I want end users to customize my pages, what should I do? He said put them in a library, which I get that. I don't want them in a library. What else can I do? The page that I'm deploying is a web part page. Web part pages are designed for end users to customize and or personalize, which means add web pages or set their own personal settings on that, right? I wrote a web part. I'm going to put it on a web part page. So if I go back to the Visual Studio and I look at my article details page, you can see it's ASPX. There's no code behind on that. What I did is I found the default web part page. It had, I think it was the typical 2-column web part page. It's in the SharePoint root folder somewhere. I can never remember what it is, but I know it's called Smart PGS, so I always search for Smart PGS, and you'll find it. And I just copied it and cleaned it up. This is a typical ASP.NET page. It references a master page, so it uses content placeholders, and I just filled them in as appropriate. And so this particular CSS here, this came with all along. I might have hidden the quick launch. I can't remember. We'll find out in a minute. And if I scroll down to placeholder main, you can see here's S4 die. I don't know why S4 is mad, but they want it to die. Yeah, so this is a typical 2-column web part page. It's using a table. So there's no, who are usability experts in the room? None, thank God I can use a table. And you can see here I'm putting in I have a web part zone, and then I have the web part page, SP user code webs, the web part that I found on Victor's blog, and I'm pointing this at my KB articles details. So this is how I can have my grid, when I click on it, go to this page. Notice I know the name of this page because I wrote it. I know where it gets deployed because I wrote the elements, so I know this is where it's going to be. Therefore, in my grid, in the code behind my grid, I can specify the URL for the detail page because I know where it's at. And end users can't see it and delete it. Now, they could launch SharePoint Designer and do something with it, but we're not going to go there. So if all is working well, my list has got items in there, so I'm going to go back to my home page and click on the first one, just for grins, and it should take me to my details page. And it did. So you can see, when I click on it, it navigates to that page. That page has the SP user control web part. So it spawned the process, did what it had to do, ran the web part. Remember, it was a simple thing, get the query string ID. If you look up here, ID equals 171. So it got that. And you can see it rendered nice and neat. Now, I made this a web part page. Originally, I did make it a web part page, but then as we talked about it, remember we said the rest of the week we're going to be having related items and related people? How am I going to show related items and related people? I have a web part page. I can add them to the web part. So there's one more thing here that I need to cover, right? So I'm deploying this application. If I go in here now and I go into this application details page, this is ID 171. It's kind of weird for me to say I want to put a web part on this page because I'm going to click the first item I find and modify it. And when you think about it in a real-world deployment, when I first deploy this, how many articles do I have in my list? Zero. So how do I get to the detail page to customize it? Well, I know it, right? I could type in the URL because I'm the developer. But if it's a production box, should I be doing that? Should I be logging on to production to change that? The answer is no. So I need to provide a way for my end users to get to this page. This was just Paul thinking off the top of his head, put myself in the user's shoe, I want to do this. And so the last thing that we talked about here is a custom action, which has to be provision a link. And so what I've done, I'll show you the slides in a minute, but on site settings, down here you'll see my knowledge base application details page. So I just put a link in here in the group called site administration, for lack of a better place to put it. What I wanted to do was create a custom action group, which would make its own name down here, and I actually got an icon. I talked to the design people, the ladies upstairs making everything pretty, and I said I need all these types of features. Again, it's one of those things I can't deploy in the sandbox. So if you download the advanced one, you'll see there's a group, and I have a pretty icon there, so it stands out by itself. The idea around this is that it gives me a way for an empty application, if you will. I can navigate to that page, and notice this is why I put my placeholders in here, so I can see how it looks. And I can put this page in edit mode, which I expect you'll see later in the week. And once it's in edit mode, you'll see I have 2 web part zones, and I can then customize this page as is appropriate for my instance of the application. Sound good? I heard a yes in the front row, thank goodness. So closing this up, in my SP group, I have custom actions. Custom action is one of the built-in spies. When I say add new item, I can choose it from the list. And so you can see here I have just some XML. Before 2010, in WSS version 3 and prior, custom actions is how we customize everything. This is how you put items on the context menu and on the site actions. Nowadays, custom actions is used a lot to mess with the ribbon, which we didn't do any of that this week, but it still works in the old school way. So you can see here I'm just typing in the URL to my page. And now I've simply provided a way for people to get to it and add web parts to it without there being content out there. So it was custom actions. Yeah, okay. Here's again a slide that shows all the things that I would have liked to do. I don't have time to go into details, right, Eric? You want to get out here? So again, I want to point out, think about your CSS. Right? We did a separate file, and you can see I put it as a server control and just did some code behind to fix the link. That may work for you, it may not work for you. Later on, they'll deploy a web template, and deploying a CSS file on a web template is much easier than deploying it the way I was doing it. Maybe it's more appropriate to update the master page that's been used by your site. Again, that's something for you to choose. And that's all I have for part 2. Any questions? Thank you. Any questions for now, or we'll just keep moving? Yes, in the back.
You know the custom actions bit, the details page? Why don't you copy Microsoft's announcements list and just put an item on the list?
So the question was, instead of a custom action to get me a link to there, why didn't I just provision a list, announcements or links, and put it on there?
So when you create an announcements list, it's got an item already in there that says, this is your list.
Okay.
Why not say yourself the dev and put an item in the list of your articles?
Yeah, so he's suggesting we could have just, as we initially deploy the knowledge base application to a site, put one entry in there like a welcome to the K-base. That's a perfectly acceptable solution. It's not as much fun from a developer perspective. And as we mentioned before, by the time I'm involved, they want a developer anyway, so how much more is it? Plus, it demos well.
And that is the most important thing. So first of all, I need right here to say that everyone on this team and this week owes Paul a huge debt of gratitude because he wrote almost all of this code by himself for this project. So, Paul, we thank you. And now I'm going to tell you everything he did wrong. So now we're going to talk about testing.
You don't have enough time.
Yeah, wow, 25 minutes. Okay. All right. We all know we should do testing, right? Nod with me. Yes, Eric, we should do testing. Do we do testing? No. Why? What did you say? Just go to production? It's all production? We ran out of time? I heard that. What's the other reason? It's not in the budget. Well, it was when you proposed it, and that's the first thing they cut, right? Right, along with your vacation time. So, is testing important? Yes, we all know it's important. Okay, I have some slides here to take to the boss to say, please give me 10 extra hours so I can do some kind of testing. We're going to skip through these very quickly so we can move on to doing a little bit of optimization in code. There's really two things I want to impart to you. Some people I know were here year before last when Woody and I did a whole unit testing piece. So he's not here, so I can say whatever I want now, and there's no TDD monkeys to correct me and tell me I'm wrong. So the soapbox, this one right here, is mine for the next 25 minutes. So you get my opinion on testing. Take it or leave it. Two things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about unit testing and integration testing because they're both important, and I think they're the two things that we as developers actually have some control over. The rest of the stuff, regression and performance and all that sort of stuff, we don't get to control that. That happens afterwards. We are going to show you some performance stuff tomorrow and some profiling things, and we'll do some load and web tests. But primarily, these are the two things that we get to control. It would be nice if we had a perfect environment like people who sit around and write books, where we can say, I want to have this beautiful testing methodology, and I'm going to write tests first, and all of my methods are going to pass all of my tests, and they all return an object, and what a load of you-know-what. That never happens in production, okay? What I'd like to get across to you is any testing is better than no testing, right? If you're only testing one method out of a solution, that's one more method than you were testing before. Don't believe that there is ever such a thing as 100% code coverage. That's a myth. That'll never happen. You probably will be lucky if you ever get to work on a solution that has more than 30 or 40% code coverage. But that 30 or 40% can save you a lot of maintenance time and dollars down the road. What project sponsors don't get and what customers don't get is that by taking testing out, they're costing themselves a boatload of money after you leave. All right, or the next person has to come over and take in that project. Because what do we do when we see an old project? We go, no, I'm throwing that code out and rewriting it because I don't have a clue what it does, and I can't chase down these 57 classes. Not going to happen. Rewrite it, okay? And people are going to do the same thing to your code, no matter how good it is, right? Unless it's testable, unless they have some way that they can validate that. Convincing the people that hold the budget about that is a very, very hard thing to do. I'm not any better at it than you are in convincing them to do it, but we got to try. Okay, if we can just get a few hours in the project for testing, we got to try. I don't care what kind of testing you do. I really don't. Select something that works for your team and stick with it, right? I don't care if you stand on one foot and hold your finger in the air and swirl the mouse with the left finger. Whatever it takes in your environment, make it happen, and then stick with it. So whatever that method, I'm not going to get into an argument over this methodology or that methodology or fail first or all that. I don't care. Test it. Some way, somehow, make sure that your code gets tested. Focus on the first two. If you can on the third one, you probably won't get a chance to do that. But if you can, focus on those first two pieces, which is what we're going to talk about. But first, we're going to talk about code optimization because you can't test it if it ain't testable. So, this is where I get to pick on Paul, right? I can...
I forgot to say I wrote it badly so Eric can fix it later.
You did, eh? They're not buying that any more than I was. Okay, let's go to one of these where a query is issued in one of these. Oh, goody, we have a query. Awesome. This is a page load method. Let's assume he had it in just a data load method. But what's wrong with that method? Can't test it. Why? Doesn't take anything. Doesn't return anything. How am I supposed to test that? I can't. Oh, I can integration test it a little bit, see if the page works, but I can't do anything with that method, right? Oh, yeah, it's also protected, which means I can't get to it even if it did take something and return something. So first, before I can do any testing, I've got to actually design my code to be testable, which means I have to do some, hopefully, planning in advance, more likely than not refactoring once we're done. That's okay. Again, I don't care if you test it first or test it last, as long as it gets tested, right? It doesn't matter if somebody drove it before you, the Corvette is still yours. I guess that doesn't apply here. The Aston Martin is still yours. Doesn't matter if someone owned it before you did, right? Okay. So what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to take core methods that do things, that retrieve data, that set something up, that construct a view class, something, and make them take a parameter and return something to us so that we can make them testable. So we want to refactor these classes that have monstrous amounts of methods, and you scroll 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 to get through all these methods. Let's break those things up into some smaller classes, right, so that we have fewer methods that we can run tests against. If you can, try to avoid the temptation of going all the way the other direction and ending up with 100,000 classes, one class for every method. That's a really bad idea. It's really hard to keep track of all that stuff. So do something reasonable, okay? And isolate some of that code. So let's look at I'm going to take the code that Paul wrote, and I'm going to optimize it a little bit so I can make a couple of the core things that he's doing testable. I'm not going to try and refactor everything, because the truth is, not everything needs to be refactored. Test the stuff that's most important to your application. A lot of time, that's data retrieval, right? If you can just get code coverage on your data retrieval classes for testing, you've made a huge, huge impact on the maintenance of that code or the maintainability of that code. And what?
Security code, make sure you don't disclose.
And security. We don't care about that. We're developers. It's their problem. Okay. So I'm going to come down here to the summary, all right? And Paul was making this query here where he's going to go out and get some data. So I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to factor this out into a separate class so that I can make it testable. But I'm going to do two different types of refactoring. I'm going to refactor once for integration testing and once for unit testing, okay? To do the unit testing, which can't rely on any of the SharePoint framework bits, if it's a true unit test, you would have to mock all that stuff. I'm going to actually write the camel, the raw camel, for this query. Okay? I'm not a huge link guy. It's okay if you want to use it. That's cool. I don't trust SP Metal. I want to write the camel myself. So we're going to have a class that constructs a little camel for us. That's going to be our unit test. And then we are going to do a little bit of integration. So let me kill this solution here, open up the one that Paul was kind enough to close for me, and I'll show you the refactored solution. So everything essentially looks pretty much the same as what he built. No, I would not like to go online. I don't want TFS. Someone might look at my code, and then my phone will ring, and I have to answer questions. I don't like that. Okay, code. Here we go. I'm going to add two classes. I'm going to add a unit class down here at the bottom, and I'm going to add a integration class up here at the top. I know these are not very creative names, but I'm not very creative. I got unit here, and I've got integration here. The first class, I'm going to factor out that query code, and I'm going to have a public method that takes in an SP web object, an SP list object, and some variables. Remember, we're sorting by and sorting and filtering in our grid with a status, a category, and keywords. If you remember his query, he was doing some Lambda expressions to inject that stuff in if those things exist. Well, I need to know they're there so I can construct the proper camel in order to emulate the same results. So I'm going to take those parameters in. And this time I'm going to return an IEnumerable generic list, which is just a list of a type KB article that's going to return the KB article. That's a generic class that all it has is the properties on it here, right here. And I'm just doing gets and sets for all the properties. Okay? That gives me an object that I can now instantiate that's not dependent on anything. The data context stuff is dependent on the link stuff and what SP Metal generated. This class is dependent on nothing. So I can use this in my unit and integration test to establish the type of object that I'm after. In my integration test, I am then going to build a camel string. This is going to call my unit test. code to build a camel query passing in the parameters. I'm then going to loop through the results that I get, grab the SP list item collection, do some nasty for each looping, and return back I add those items to my generic list and return it, instantiating a new article as the object. Okay, pretty straightforward stuff. In my unit test, I'm going to generate this camel string. So I'm going to take in these parameters, status, category, and keywords. Now, notice, there is no reference in here to Microsoft.SharePoint. That's because this is a unit test. We can't have framework dependencies in a unit test. We do want framework dependencies in an integration test. We're going to test an integration that it's actually talking to SharePoint. But in our unit test, we don't want that. We want to make sure that this code is standalone, and it doesn't matter what happens after that. So it's an atomic approach, starting with the unit, going to the integration, and testing on my way up the stack. So here, I'm actually going to write out this camel that Paul was too afraid to write himself. And do it all by building a string. His approach is better, honestly. I mean, look at this nonsense. I've got to come in and write all this stuff. I am using some constants, but I've got to do all that. Remember that things are called like mod stat instead of moderation status, and get my underscore x0020s and all that sort of stuff in my constants file, which he didn't have to deal with, but I do. It's not good enough for me to have just the original name. I also need the internal name, because camel doesn't use the display name. It needs the internal name, which has all of its funkiness around it. So none of these, because we did this on purpose because we know it's going to happen, none of these have spaces in them, right? That's on purpose, because we don't want to deal with the underscore x0020 stuff when we have to write the camel. But if you have them in your situation, then you're going to have to remember to take care of that. So I'm simply doing the same injection he was doing with the Lambda expressions. I'm just writing out the AND clauses here. Here's my equal, here's my contains, my AND where, and bang, I send you back a string of camel. So you send me in some parameters, I send you back a formatted string, and now I have something that's testable at the unit level and the integration level. In Visual Studio 2010 SP1, they cut us some slack, and they gave us a built-in unit testing. So I can right-click on one of these methods, and I can say create unit tests. And it will put together all the various bits and pieces that I need. It figured out the method that I wanted, and it says, okay, I'm going to create a unit test for you, and I can go down here to the settings. I could say, here's what I want you to name it. Here's my class name. Here's my method name, et cetera, et cetera. That will generate a project for me that looks like this down at the bottom. So we can see here I've got my project for my tests, I've got my integration test, and I've got my unit test in here. Ideally, you would separate those into different, you wouldn't want to put all that in the same project code, especially if you're doing something like type mock or in unit. You want to have those separated out, okay? But for convenience, I put them in the same one. So let's go and look at the unit test code that it generated. In fact, better yet, let's just do one. Okay, so you can see what it gives you out of the box. So I'm going to go ahead and create a unit test, right, and say OK. And it'll go out and create one for me, and it wires up all the stuff that I need. So it sets my instances. It even looks at the parameters that I'm passing into my method, creates the arrange code for me. So those of you who are familiar with unit testing, I've got arrange, act, and assert. Right? So it does that for me automatically, sets up the test methods. It's all good stuff, and I don't have to think about wiring all that stuff together. Now let me remove it from the solution, or it will never build. Okay, so I have the same thing here in my unit test, where I've just simply gone in and, where'd it go? There, thank you. Okay. So I got the same thing in here, and all I've done is set up my arrange so that I have some strings that I want to work with. I'm setting up an expected string. This is the camel that I think I'm going to get back when I run this unit test. And then I'm just doing an assert r equal and pass it in. Now, I've got two methods that I'm using, one with filter and one without filter. Okay, and it's just simple, just adding or removing camel. So the first one is a no filter, and there's one with a filter. I like to follow the naming convention. This is one area where Woody and I do agree on what method you're testing and what it's doing in its test, in the test name. So I can just look at them and go, I know what this particular test is doing. So in my test view, I can now run my tests. Okay, you'll see them listed over here. But wait, there's something else I need to do, because if you just right-click in Visual Studio and say Create Unit Tests, they will not run for two reasons. One, because Visual Studio is so nice and it cares so much about the fact that you are on the very latest and greatest code base, it will automatically set your test framework to run under .NET 4. Will that work with SharePoint? Not a bloody chance. It sure won't. So we have to go in and fix it. That'll be for our integration tests, okay? The second thing is you have to set this bad boy up to make sure that it, in your local settings, runs on, come on Visual Studio, you can do it. Edit test settings, local. Make sure that it runs on, under here, under hosts, that run 64-bit on a 64-bit machine. By default, it will fall back to the 32-bit because Visual Studio still in 2012 is a 32-bit application. Make sure that you set that or these aren't going to run. Okay, so now I will go back to my test itself. Let's go to the test view here, and where is my unit test? Here is my unit test, get camel query, and let's just run this guy right here. Run selection, the test window will open down at the bottom, and it will tell us, is our test working? Look at that, it passed, huh? How about that action? Okay, now, my integration test. Let's look at the integration test. This one should be self-explanatory by this time. What we're going to do is we are going to start instantiating in our arrange code. We're going to start instantiating some, go away. We're going to start instantiating some SharePoint objects. Why? Because this is an integration test, and we actually want to test the framework. Visual Studio will see that when you right-click to create a unit test. If you have a dependency on the Microsoft.SharePoint DLLs, it will see that and automatically add them into your test solution for you. Okay? So I'm going to set up a site object. I'm going to set up a web, a list, my keywords that I want to pass in. I'm instantiating a list of the article type that I'm looking for and going out and getting the articles. And then I'm doing some asserts down at the bottom to make sure that I'm actually getting some content back. So all I'm trying to do is get one object out of the list. If I get one object and it's an object of type KB article, then it's good. And my integration test passed. It means that the framework is functional. Look at the URL, and when I run the test, this test is going to fail because there's no data in that list. And it will tell you here exactly what happened. It's going to go off the screen when I zoom in, but you can see here, list articles does not exist at site with blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it's actually returning you the SP exception error and getting it back and say, hey, I can't do anything with this because there's nothing there, right? So my arrange, there's nothing wrong with my test code. It's my arrange that's wrong. Paul, what was your site that you're using, Sites Dev 204?
Yes.
Okay, so if I change this here to Sites Dev 204, unless he retracted that, hopefully he didn't, then we'll have some content here, so I'll do that down here as well. And let's run this test again and see if it works now that we're pointing it at something that actually has data with it. So we'll see if it builds. Survey says, probably going to fail. Okay, so now I have a bad assert. Okay, I'm going out and getting my data, but there's something wrong in the assertion in my integration test. Well, I wonder what that could be. What's the problem here? All right. In my assert, aha, I'm probably not getting back some actual IDs and expected IDs for my item. So I have a problem with my assertion, okay? And I can tell you exactly what it is. He's got it sorting in reverse order, and I'm looking for item 0 out of the list. That gets it without a sort. If I had one item in this list, it would work. It doesn't. How many did you put in there, Paul? What was the last one? Let's find out. If I look on, if I go home, here we go. And that one is ID equal 171. Lord only knows if that's the actual item in the list. Let's find out. It probably isn't. 170. If all works well, it should be that, and it probably won't. Test. Let's run that selection and see if that returns back to us, or we can change our assert clause to get back. I could also build my test so that it goes and checks and see what the last one is, right? So I just have an invalid assert on that particular test, and we all know the best way to deal with that is to simply remove an assert, right? That's the greatest way to make a test pass, because then all I have to do is go in and do this and say run that bad boy, and life will be good. Yes, I want a new test run result, because at the end of the day, the only thing that you really care about is did it fail, and it failed again. All right, so I lose both ways. There's one above it. What? I'll run them all. Try that one. The other one probably worked because it was just checking to see if it was all the articles, right? Let's see if we get anything out of that. I'm sure the integer. Look at that, huh? That's all we care about. We got a green button, right? That's it. It's because I took the assert out. Okay. So, in summary, let's switch back over here. In summary, I'm not going to go through the rest. These are all stuff. You can go through all this stuff yourself and show these to your boss as to why he should give you more time to do all this stuff. We are a couple minutes to the end of time, so we actually got you out of here relatively on time. First of all, I want to thank everybody for sitting with us all day and going through this. We really appreciate you hanging in there with us. Tomorrow is a lot of heavy coding on the advanced feature set. So you make sure you want to stick around for that. They're going to do some of the cool code. If you have any questions, we'll stick around afterwards, and we'll be milling about in the vendor thing out there. So thank you, everybody.